Is reshoring working? Will AI take away jobs? And safety in trucking fleets. Pull up a chair and join us as the editors of DC Velocity discuss these stories as well as news and supply chain trends on this week's Logistics Matters podcast. I am Dave Maloney. I'm the Group Editorial Director at DC Velocity. Welcome. Logistics Matters is sponsored by Werner. In cross-border shipping, experience is everything. With more than 25 years of trusted expertise in Mexico, Werner moves your freight seamlessly across the border. Their bilingual teams handle the customs and compliance, so you don't have to. Get the reliability your supply chain deserves. Become a customer today at choosewerner.com. As usual, our DC Velocity senior editors Ben Ames and Victoria Kickham will be along to provide their insights into the top stories of this week. But to begin today, there's been an effort in recent years to return manufacturing to the United States, as much of this production has been outsourced to overseas factories for decades. But have these attempts been successful? Joining us to find out more is our guest, Patrick van den Bossche. He's a partner with global management consulting firm Kearney, and he's the lead author of new research called 2026 Reshoring Index Report. Welcome, Patrick, to Logistics Matters.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
First of all, for those not familiar with the work of Kearney, can you tell us a bit about your organization and how it works within the supply chain industry?
Sure. We're a 100-year-old global consultancy, and we made a name for ourselves actually in supply chain, helping our clients with all sorts of issues across the full value chain, from planning, sourcing to manufacturing and logistics. Things like performance, of course, but also resilience and growth are typically top of the agenda for them. As you can imagine, of course, a big part of our work today is helping clients figure out how to best combine their operational expertise with all this stuff, digital analytics and AI, and come out better and stronger.
Great. And you are a very well-respected organization with the industry and helping them also navigate, I'm sure, all the things that are going on this year, such as we've had global trade disruptions, tariffs, several major wars, high interest rates, oil shock due to the Iran war. How have all of those events shaped this year's Reshoring Index report?
Well, in surprising ways, mostly. We've been tracking this reshoring index for the past 13 years, and one of the big changes in the last 4 years is that we've had record manufacturing investments up to 3 times the level of what we saw before 2021. So we were expecting that we would be ready to turn on U.S. manufacturing when the Liberation Day tariffs hits. But that's not at all what happened. We saw actually that U.S. imports of manufacturing goods climbed another 4.6%, or about 133 billion. And on the other side, domestic output was essentially flat. If anything, was actually slightly declining. And when it comes to these record investments, companies basically report that on aggregate, they've only added about 1.5% in capacity. So despite all the expectations that all the shocks you just talked about, Dave, would reduce globalization in favor of reshoring, we're actually seeing that globalization is alive and well. But if anything, it's become more tactical and more fragmented, because companies are basically saying, look, we need optionality because the world is becoming even more unpredictable. And that's maybe the key driver of what we've been seeing in this year's report. Any potential positive effect that the combination of all these investments and tariffs may have had on reshoring was just completely negated by just the sheer level of uncertainty that companies are facing. And any reshoring momentum we had was just put on hold.
As you mentioned, that was one of the administration's goals in implementing the tariffs and seeking new foreign investments and other trade policies, was to spur on that new domestic manufacturing. As you had mentioned, it seems to be actually kind of the opposite is happening right now, at least. We've seen some growth, but over the years, but not really a lot this year. We've had manufactured imports actually hitting a 4-year high. And the latest job report just came out from the Department of Labor, showing that we actually lost 2,000 manufacturing jobs last month alone. So you had mentioned all these concerns here. Why do you think there is that disconnect between what the intention is for reshoring and the result? Is it just because of all that uncertainty out there?
That's definitely a big driver. Of course, going in, economists will tell you that tariffs typically have a tendency to reallocate trade flows rather than rebuild industrial capacity. And especially the sort of broad-based tariffs we've seen tend to cause just disruption. They raise cost, they raise risk, but they don't automatically do anything to create any kind of substitute or domestic substitutes at scale because they just don't impact how fast investments are turned into near-term productive capacity. And that's a bit of the disconnect. It really comes down to three things, Dave. One is capacity obviously takes time, right? Especially large projects like semiconductors, pharma, and so on can take years to come online. And that's even without facing all these hurdles about permits and labor and material availability that these projects have faced here in the US and that have definitely been well documented in the press. The other thing is, cost gaps are still there and they still matter, even with tariffs. Many products are still cheaper to make abroad. And in fact, the report highlights some examples in electronics like laptops and smartphones. But the same is true in other more labor-intensive categories. And then the third thing is we've seen that demand didn't go away. U.S. consumption remains strong even to this day, despite everything that's happened. So if the domestic supply doesn't grow, then imports have to fill that gap, right? So these three things, and then combine that with the fact, as you said, all these uncertainties around shifting tariffs, geopolitical escalation, including now energy volatility because of the Iran war, the financing cost. That all creates a planning environment for executives that make them very reluctant to make any kind of irreversible bets. And then you look at it through that lens, all this stuff starts to make a bit more sense, right? So we asked executives what they've been doing, and instead of reshoring, they prioritized flexibility above anything. It started with building inventory, especially during the first quarter of last year before the Liberation Day tariffs. But then afterwards, they started switching suppliers and diversifying countries, especially towards more Asian low-cost countries and regions outside of China, of course. Those are all defensive, reversible moves. They're not bringing back manufacturing to the US, which, according to the survey, only about 20% of companies even contemplated. And that maybe links and corresponds with another clear indicator that ties back to that uncertainty point. Only about 18% of CEOs said that they were confident they'd be getting a reasonable ROI from reshoring, and that was down from 47% last year. So all in all, the policies and tariffs, they changed where companies sourced, not whether they import.
Yeah, you mentioned that there was a shift. Which kind of countries benefited from those shifting policies and moving maybe manufacturing away from China to other nations? And what kind of products basically are we talking about?
Yeah, winners and losers was very clear. Mainland China was down about a third, about 135 billion. Canada took a hit too. They came down 9%, 25 billion in their share of imports. But, the Asian low-cost countries were the big winners, especially Southeast Asia with Vietnam and Thailand on top, but also Indonesia and Cambodia to an extent gained share. They combined went up 35% across all these Asian low-cost countries, or about 194 billion. Mexico was another winner again because they've been the largest importer nation of manufactured goods into the US for the last 3 years now. And their imports grew another 8% on the back of growing strength in electronics assembly. Europe also gained a little bit, but that was really mostly because of a massive front loading that we saw in the first quarter of 2025. Their quarterly imports for that quarter went up 66% versus the year before. But then after post-Liberation Day, it sort of mellowed a little bit. And at the end of the day, Europe did still gain about 62 billion. There's an important consequence to all of this, though. The supply chains really didn't shorten, right? Companies rerouted as part of sort of a broader movement where they are picking channels that preserve the cost advantage and the market access, but are not going domestic. And even some of those products that are now coming into the US from nearby Mexico are still relying for most parts and components and materials on Asian sources, and that includes China.
Well, that makes sense. Again, you just talked about Canada and Mexico, our two nearest neighbors. When we talk about reshoring, we also talk about nearshoring or shortening the length
Mhm.
of the supply chain. But of course, the US government has not really been the best of friends with Canada and Mexico with this year politically. with tariffs and a lot of talk back and forth, making Canada the 51st state, all that kind of stuff. So, how might that affect the USMCA agreements that are due for review later this year and the results of reshoring as a part of that?
I think USMCA becomes even more valuable for companies, but also more fragile in a world of high tariffs that we live in right now. It's just one of the few remaining duty-free corridors still into the US. But here's the wrap, though. The US is likely to use that whole review process to raise regional content thresholds and then tighten the enforcement of transshipments and restrict non-market content specifically from China. And I guess that would strengthen North America strategically, but it would also raise the bar economically. So the practical implication of more stringent rules of origin and stronger enforcement would really mean that for companies, it sort of reduces the quote unquote easy pathway of nearshoring with assembly in Mexico with Asia components. Unless, of course, the ecosystem starts to localize further. And we already see that in our survey. 55% of executives said that they expect nearshoring will be less attractive in the future.
That's very interesting. So, what will it take to increase our domestic manufacturing? Does it really need to be done? Is it better to offshore some of these products? And if we are going to be producing them here in the US, what types of products are best for manufacturing domestically?
Well, that's a very important question, and it's one we've tried to answer for the last 13 years. Every year we've put this reshoring index together. One thing I do can tell you already right now, tariffs alone are not the answer, right? I think you need four things simultaneously. You need cost competitive first and foremost, and that's not just labor, but also materials. Interestingly, people that had already reshored are still relying to a large extent on materials coming from overseas. So they were actually hit by those tariffs. And that was a bit of a nasty surprise. That ties to the second point you really need, and that is, I think, a much more sturdy supplier ecosystem. Tier two, tier three type gaps are still significant. And unless that's something, for instance, that China has spent 30, 40 years building. So unless some of that starts to come back here, that'll continue to be a challenge. And then you mentioned earlier labor, the amount of people working in manufacturing has come down. The job openings have come down. But interestingly, still about 61% of companies report challenges with finding skilled labor. So fixing that skilled labor, technical labor, definitely remains something that needs to be addressed because it is a constraint still. And then last but not least, I mean, political stability, right? Companies can't invest if the rules change constantly. Clarity, I think, is more valuable than any kind of incentive that tariffs can ever provide. In fact, one of my favorite quotes that we got through our survey was from an operations executive, and he said, "Our manufacturing team is ready to run onto the field, but we just need the goalposts to stop moving."
That makes a lot of sense. We've been talking today with Patrick van den Bosch. He's a Kearney partner and lead author of the Kearney Report on 2026 Reshoring Index. Thank you again, Patrick, for your insights today.
My pleasure.
Now let's take a look at some of the other supply chain news from the week. Artificial intelligence has so many upsides that investors are betting big right now on the benefits of the technologies. You could just look at the stock market, of course, for evidence of that. But we do hear of the downside of the many jobs that AI may eliminate. And Ben, you wrote this week about a new report telling about how AI will affect jobs in a number of markets and segments.
Yeah, and we've talked and written a lot about artificial intelligence lately, of course. It seems to be in every press release that comes into our inboxes. But we're often talking about sort of process and how it affects warehousing and transportation and robotics. But the report this week talked, as we're saying, about more broadly about how it might affect jobs and on a really high level of measuring, like the unemployment rates for entire countries. So this was a report from the French insurance company Allianz, and it was mainly about how this week's low unemployment rates for the US and also recent ones for European labor markets are really near historic low unemployment, which is good. But it said that there were risks that were from undercurrents like immigration policies, restrictions, energy price shocks from the Iran war, and artificial intelligence. So digging into the AI part, it's said that the latest data available show that AI is having what's known as a K-shaped pattern on labor markets. That means there's not just one line describing the impact, but it affects different sort of demographic groups in different ways. And that K-shaped pattern impacts the youth and mid-level white-collar workers. Their jobs are the most at risk, especially those who perform what the report called routine cognitive tasks. On the other hand, the other side of the K-shaped curve was higher skilled AI complementary roles in that white collar group who actually benefit from the AI.
Right. Well, that's interesting. And it makes sense that AI could affect the jobs of white collar workers more than blue collar, but it might not affect them all the same, right?
Yeah, it really depends exactly what your job role demands in terms of the tasks that you do every day. Allianz's report looked at a slightly longer horizon, and they said the medium term impact of AI on labor markets will be what they call substantial, but uneven across different countries. So over the next 1 to 3 years, they said AI is expected to affect about a quarter of jobs across these major economies, primarily through reorganization of the staff. And that would came in well above the expected midterm impacts of augmenting jobs or outright displacing the jobs. So, looking at different countries, the report said that the share of jobs that could be affected in those three ways ranges from nearly a third in the US to much lower numbers, like a fifth in the UK, Germany, France, Spain, Italy. So, what's going to happen to all these workers? Ultimately, whether AI leads to job losses or reorganizations or new job creation will depend less on technology, the report said, than on policy choices. So Allianz talked about what they called AI proofing policies in the labor markets. They mentioned things like reskilling and upskilling, active labor market programs to manage the labor market pool, and social protections. So those things will shape worker transitions, whether those transitions are, again, being reorganized within the company, finding a new job, or losing a job.
Be interesting to dig a little bit deeper into that, why the US would be more affected than European countries, and maybe because of their job training programs. But that's obviously something that needs to be done, just as we've seen transitions in the past. You'd have auto mechanics now instead of blacksmiths, for instance. Jobs change because of technologies and advancements. I guess we can only hope that the changes will happen slowly enough that workers will have the time needed to adjust their skills to whatever that new reality becomes.
I think that's right. Yep. The report also mentioned that there might be a split between how fast workers can react, as you said, and how fast companies might reorganize. So we might be in for a little bit of a bumpy road until those two things get synced up.
Thank you, Ben.
Glad to.
And Victoria, we often write about safety in the trucking industry in DC Velocity. And this week you wrote about some new research concerning the safety practices of mid-sized and smaller fleets.
Yeah, that's right, Dave. So, this is based on a report that's about truck safety, specifically ways that fleet managers and corporate risk managers can help their drivers improve and enhance safety on the road. And as we know, there's a wealth of data in trucking today, much of it derived from the telematics and other sort of advanced technology tools that connect what's happening in the truck to a company's broader IT system. And this generates a large amount of information for companies to use to improve safety and enhance operations in other ways as well. So the trucking industry insurance firm Northland Insurance recently surveyed 300 managers who work with small and mid-sized fleets, and they found a common refrain about all that information that companies are receiving. Most claim to be data rich, but say they are starved for ways to best use the information they get from all of those tech tools. And I'll give you just one quick example from the survey. Although most managers said they feel confident using telematics data to improve safety, 49% of those at mid-sized fleets and 43% of those working with small fleets said they have difficulty translating telematics insights into actionable coaching or safety improvements. And those insights can include measures like speeding and other driving behaviors.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Does the report offer any ideas for solving this problem?
It does. It offers 7 steps managers can take to sort through all the noise of the data so they can act on all that information that sort of pops up in their dashboards and reports. And those steps include things like identifying high impact behaviors and looking for patterns, not isolated events, building buy-in at every level of the organization, so you're really kind of promoting a culture of safety, and then just sort of raising hiring standards. And I'll share one other statistic from the survey that caught my eye. In-person training was cited as the most effective safety tool, which the report authors said really underscores the importance of driver engagement alongside all of this technology. So even with all the tech at our fingertips, the human element is still a vital part of any safety improvement process.
Right, technology is great, but you still need people engaged to make that technology work for you.
That is absolutely true.
Thank you, Victoria.
You're welcome.
We encourage listeners to go to dcvelocity.com for more on these and other supply chain stories. Also, check out the podcast notes section for some direct links to read more about the topics that we discussed today. And we'd like to thank Patrick von de Bossche of Kearney for being our guest. We welcome your comments on this topic and our other stories. You can email us at podcast@agilebme.com. We also encourage you to subscribe to Logistics Matters at your favorite podcast platform. Our new episodes are uploaded on Fridays. And a reminder, Logistics Matters is sponsored by Werner. In cross-border shipping, experience is everything. With more than 25 years of trusted expertise in Mexico, Werner moves your freight seamlessly across the border. Their bilingual teams handle the customs and compliance, so you don't have to. Get the reliability your supply chain deserves. Become a customer today at choosewerner.com. We'll be back again next week with another edition of Logistics Matters. Be sure to join us. Until then, have a great week.